Hello, my name is Gloriana Rodriguez. I will be discussing the peace accords in Guatemala signed in 1996. And the first slides are some images of Guatemala. I basically just wanted you to see how beautiful the country is. The first image with a yellow arch is of Antigua. Then right below is Tikal, the site of the Mayan pyramids. The next photo is another pyramid, which was swallowed by the jungle. Archaeologists unearthed half of it, and they decided to let the jungle keep the other half. Then there's also a tuk-tuk, which is the little truck you see, which is used to get around. And then the last image is a Hunapu volcano, which the Mayans call the place of flowers. So just to give a brief overview of the presentation, we're going to first examine the historical antecedents. That means the social, political, and economic colonial order, and the origins of the security apparatus. From then, we will explore an occupied country. That's the title of a book by Eduardo Galeano about this period in Guatemalan history. So we're going to look at the October Revolution, which was an attempt at state reform, and then the coup of 1954, which was a critical juncture in Guatemalan history. From that, we're going to look at the doctrine of national security, and we're going to examine the social, the ideological, and the ethnic and racial dimension of the Civil War, specifically the Mayan genocide. Lastly, we're going to look at the peace process, which is how the society tried to redefine its own social contract and the institutional underpinnings of a security universe in the aftermath of a 36-year civil war. Lastly, we're also going to look at some critiques of the Accords, and then the rise of transnational crime. We're going to explore the consequences of unaddressed historical and socioeconomic issues in the context of regional insecurity. Historically, the regimes in control of the Guatemalan territory have relied on repression. The process of colonization was rooted in the extreme political and economic exploitation of indigenous peoples. This was justified by a racist discourse which deemed the indigenous peoples subhuman. Now, over time, the social, political, and economic colonial model led to the rise of a very powerful elite. In turn, this elite used the administrative and security colonial apparatus to promote their private commercial interests. This led to the creation of extractive institutions. Now, Acemoglu makes a distinction between extractive institutions, in which a small group of individuals exploit the rest of the population, and inclusive institutions, in which many people are included in the process of governing. Hence, the exploitation process is either lessened or absent. And in the case of Guatemala, there were extractive institutions during both the colonial and the post-colonial era, because even after independence, this dynamic remained intact. Thus, the premise of the colonial social order became the premise of the post-colonial state. Security governance became the backbone of the colonial social order. The formal security apparatus, such as the army, and the informal security apparatus, such as the militias formed by landlords, played a key role in establishing this order. And indeed, the colonial social order was both created and perpetuated through repression and violence. Now, using social identity theory to examine colonial society is quite useful. Developed by Hogg and Tajfeld, social identity theory suggests that a person's sense of self is based on their group memberships. For example, the fact that you are British, or Rwandan, or Spanish, or Costa Rican, or a Christian, or an atheist. Based on a group membership, we tend to divide the world into them and us. Now, in some social contexts, powerful in-groups emerge and consolidate themselves by vilifying and scapegoating an out-group. In the colonial period, the in-group were the social elites, which included both the oligarchy and high-ranking members of the military. The outgroups initially included an emerging racially mixed social group dubbed mestizos and the indigenous peoples. Then, in the aftermath of independence from Spain in 1821, this colonial social order was not dismantled. This is why decolonial thinkers like Quijano have pointed out that independence meant the end of Spanish rule, but not the end of the colonial social identities, nor of the repression required to preserve them. Indeed, in order to maintain the colonial social order, Guatemala would be ruled by a series of authoritarian leaders. The term "an occupied country" is from a novel written by the Uruguayan writer Eduardo Galeano about this decade of Guatemalan history, and I highly recommend it. In 1944, José Arevalo was elected and became the first ever civilian to lead the nation in 123 years. From October 1944 until 1954, a democratic conscience had emerged, leading many to question and even reject some of the structural injustices and authoritarian underpinnings of their society. This is frequently referred to as the October Revolution. Arevalo's administration was followed by Arbe's, who would tailor his campaign around the need for ending "semi-colonialism" by achieving greater economic independence for more powerful countries and eliminating the vestiges of social feudalism. He criticized both the transnational companies, such as the United Fruit Company, and the oligarchy. Upon his victory, the government passed a bill allowing the government to expropriate unfarmed parts of large plantations. The land reform was indisputably the largest in Guatemalan history. It benefited 500,000 individuals at a time when the population was 3 million. And although both Arevalo and Arbenz were social democrats, the United States deemed them dangerous radicals. In August 1954, the CIA would stage a coup against the democratically elected Iranian president Mohammad Mossadegh. Its success incentivized them to try again, and soon a clandestine intervention was planned by the Eisenhower administration, who considered it preferable because it was safer and less expensive than a military intervention. So the image in this slide is a mural by the Mexican artist Diego Rivera about the coup. It shows the Guatemalans being massacred and trampled on by more powerful social actors. It shows political prisoners peering out from their cells. There is a priest holding his Bible. It also shows a member of the oligarchy shaking hands with the American generals. Indeed, many members of the elite supported the coup, and there was a coalition of sorts between the internal elites and the US determined to eliminate Arbe's and his reforms. The coup changed the nature of the relationship between the individual and the state. The military began to oversee tasks associated with civil governance, undermining the political participation of citizens, delegitimizing civilian institutions, and generalizing authoritarian culture. In this sense, whereas the 1944 revolution eliminated the figure of the dictator, the 1954 counter-revolution turned the high command of the army into the new center of the power. This led to the outbreak of the Civil War. To see a democratically elected president overthrown led many to lose faith in democracy. Thus, instead of seeking power through political parties, they took up arms, formed guerrilla groups, and retreated into the jungles. This included both many Guatemalans and individuals who happened to be in Guatemala during the coup, such as Che Guevara. The coup and subsequent civil war had far-reaching consequences. In fact, it marked a new chapter in regional security. In the context of the Cold War, there was a rise of the doctrine of national security, based on the belief that society was facing the threat of subversives, and that the army was the only institution capable of both protecting good citizens and governing the state. This legitimized absolute military rule by framing security as a defense of morality. Now the question remains, who was the subversive that was threatening the state? Initially, it was the Marxists, the labor union leaders and labor union members, then the guerrillas in the countries where there were guerrillas, but eventually it grew to also include Marxist sympathizers, a more ambiguous category, and eventually a subversive was anyone who criticized the dictatorship. This initiated a phase of extreme state violence. There was torture, disappearance, and the assassination of subversives in Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, Bolivia, Chile, Peru, El Salvador, and Guatemala. As indicated by the rise of the national security doctrine, the security discourse and policies defined the Civil War. The formal security apparatus, such as the military, replaced the government, and the informal security apparatus, such as right-wing paramilitaries and death squads, operated with near impunity. A counterinsurgency state was thus created and perpetuated through extreme repression and extreme violence. From the perspective of social identity theory, the in-group would become the military high command. Notice it is situated above the oligarchy. This is to illustrate how their power superseded even that of the wealthiest landowners. Next is the oligarchy, and then the high-ranking church officials. The marginal members included poor evangelicals who didn't have power but were also not persecuted. Then the outgroups were those who during this period were actually persecuted and even murdered. This includes the indigenous peoples who were deemed collective enemies of the state. As such, they became subject to genocide. The internal enemies included the Marxists. This is both the guerrillas who took on arms against the state, but also intellectual university professors and students. Lastly are the priests, nuns, and Catholic workers. During this period, fractions of the Catholic Church became considered part of the outgroup. As a result, they were also persecuted, perhaps for the first time in Guatemalan history. This is because in the aftermath of the Second Vatican Council in 1962 to 1965, the Church had begun to advocate on behalf of the poor. This focus on social justice, however, would be seen as an affront to the counterinsurgency strategy. Moreover, their grassroots activism was seen as a threat to the dominance of the oligarchy over the indigenous peoples and agricultural workers dubbed campesinos. Before questioning in-group privilege and violence, many Catholic workers, nuns, and priests were themselves brutally murdered. Within the context of a 36-year civil war, there would be a genocide from 1981 to 1983, carried out against the Mayan peoples who were deemed collective enemies of the state. According to the Historical Clarification Commission, the Mayan people were designated as the collective enemy of the state because of the influence of traditional racist prejudices. The army operated on the presumption that Mayans were part of the insurgency. It should be noted that Héctor Gramajo, one of the architects of the genocide, bluntly declared, "We brought the government to the village." As a result, massacres, which were called scorched earth operations, were carried out. So were assassinations targeting the Mayan leaders and spiritual guides. It was, quote, an attempt to destroy the cultural values that ensured cohesion and collective action in Mayan communities." End quote. In addition to eliminating the leadership, the counterinsurgency strategies were also ruthless with children. According to a CIA document, Mayan children were deemed bad seeds, which needed to be destroyed. These scorched earth operations were also gendered. Women were raped with extreme brutality and cruelty. By the end of 18 months, 200,000 Mayans would be dead. The peace accords were signed after a tumultuous, decade-long negotiation. Although the process was supported by the military high command, they were not willing to completely retreat from power. Subsequently, the years preceding the signing of the accords were quite dangerous for the left-wing leadership, given the military's aims to restrict their impact in the negotiations. However, there were already some civil society organizations, including several women's groups, which did participate. Officially signed in 1996 between several Marxist guerrilla groups and the government, the peace accords would include a series of treaties. Besides peace, they would also include gender, multiculturalism, and a section on security. Now, the first image shows a Mayan woman looking at photographs of the disappeared. The other image shows the celebration after the signing of the peace accords. Overall, the peace accords promoted the end of the Civil War and the subsequent democratization of Guatemala by pursuing social justice ideals. For example, there were sections regarding the recognition of indigenous rights, ethnic and racial diversity, agrarian development, social and economic rights, and the establishment of a Truth Commission. It is worth noting the Truth Commission was established. However, its results were not binding. The peace accords also included gendered economic and social objectives, such as the implementation of social services and programs for female-headed households, recognition of the rights of indigenous women, and even political quotas. Now, the two images are of two very different heroic sets of women. The first is Claudia Paz y Paz, the first female Attorney General of Guatemala. From 2010 to 2014, she made unprecedented strides in the prosecution of organized crime, corruption, and also war crimes and genocide. She prosecuted several high-profile cases against the former president, Efraín Ríos Montt, often dubbed the architect of the genocide, and she also carried out trials against the perpetrators of the Dos Eres massacre. The second image is of women from the Sepur Zarco case. It is worth noting that during the Civil War, indigenous women were systematically raped and at times enslaved by the military in a small community near the Sepur Zarco outpost. Then, from 2011 to 2016, 15 survivors went to trial to fight for justice. This trial resulted in the convictions of 2 former military officers for crimes against humanity. It is groundbreaking from a legal perspective, although it should also be noted that the women have said time and time again that for them justice is more than just a conviction. To them, justice means access to education, dignified housing, and dignified work for their community as well. The security reform is one of the most important sections of the peace accords because it signaled the transition from a counterinsurgency state to a democratic state. By extension, this implied eliminating the national security doctrine, which had permeated through Guatemala's security governance, and to exchange it for one rooted in democracy, human rights, and rule of law. To this end, the Accords foresaw a strengthening of the justice system through the creation of a judicial career and a pro bono service within the public defense. It also implied establishing a national civil police force. The commitment to peace and democracy was also reflected by the reduction of the military by 33%, also by changing its focus from counterinsurgency to peacekeeping. One of the most important transitions was in the security sector. This was the transition from military to civilian oversight. Since 1954, in the aftermath of the coup, Guatemala was under military rule, and this continued throughout the 36-year civil war. However, between 1982 to 1985, the nature of the military governance began to change. The military moved towards an inclusive authoritarianism, given that little by little more spaces for civilian participation were allowed, albeit still within the overall context of military control. In 1985, elections restored civilian leadership. However, the military was still in charge behind the scenes, and the president and Congress served at the will of the generals. In 1996, the first fully democratic elections were held. And right now, in principle, there's complete civilian oversight. However, the truth is more complex. Arevalo de Leon, a notable Guatemalan scholar, has pointed out, the military no longer exercises political control over the state, but civilian authorities do not exercise full democratic institutional control over the armed forces either. 24 years after the signing of the peace accords, there's starting to be more and more frustration. There is this sense that the peace accords ultimately reaffirmed the economic status quo. For example, it did not include any provisions regarding land reform. And even though it did include provisions regarding tax reform in order to fund more extensive social services and poverty reduction programs, the economic elites have managed to avoid and undermine any effective reforms. To this day, despite the extreme inequality, the elites refused and have managed to avoid paying higher taxes. In fact, some have even argued that the winners of the Guatemalan peace accords appear to be the business elites. Hence, the war ended, but without addressing the social injustices which fueled it. And although there have been many voices present during the peace negotiations, the democratic state which has emerged since continues to prioritize the needs and the interests of the more powerful in-groups. In addition to the historical issues mentioned, Guatemala also now has to address what is a regional insecurity crisis as a result of transnational drug trafficking, increasing crime, and the presence of gangs and cartels. It is worth noting that this is mainly because of Guatemala's geographic location between the countries which produce cocaine in South America and the country which consumes cocaine in North America. Nonetheless, it is a new security challenge, and this dilemma has aggravated pre-existing and structural issues related to poverty, institutional weakness, and impunity. Once again, security governance is key to understanding the current situation. The formal security apparatus via the National Police Force and the Army increasingly have more and more protagonism. Then, the informal security apparatus has also returned via paramilitaries and death squads, many of whom target gang members. In the context of increasing insecurity and transnational crime, the political and the social response has been authoritarianism. From the perspective of social identity theory, it seems that very little has changed. The in-group is still the economic elite. Besides the oligarchy, it includes the business sector. And the high-ranking military also continues to be part of the in-group. Likewise, the indigenous peoples continue to be part of the out-group. The difference is that now it also includes non-state actors like gangs and cartels. The outgroup also includes incarcerated men and women. Due to the repressive policies, there is now a mass incarceration crisis. In fact, Guatemala's prison occupancy had a rate of 333.2%. The peace accords promoted the end of war by endorsing greater economic and social inclusiveness. Yet, the implementation of much-needed structural reforms has been deficient. Furthermore, Guatemala is now having to cope with the rise of transnational crime. This has awakened authoritarian tendencies, once again giving them protagonism and legitimacy. Despite these many challenges, the peace accords remain an important symbol of the willingness to end a brutal civil war. Moreover, there have been valuable reforms which have created and deepened democratic institutions whose purpose is to foster greater respect for rights and inclusiveness. In this regard, the peace accords planted the seed for New Guatemala. There is now a shared collective responsibility to contribute to its growth.